Media shows why nobody trusts them. Plus, are you man-smirking? You're listening to Constructive Interference. So, we're going to talk about trust in the media today and a couple of high-profile incidents that sort of reflect on why trust in the media is where it's at and see what we can do with that. But when it comes to media, social media is really important now. We're going to emphasize that later on, and you should be following us on social media so you can hear the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? Because we've cornered the market on that. Facebook.com/TheCI Show, and on Twitter @TheCI Show. We're also on Google Play and iTunes, so make sure you get out there. And if you've missed any of our podcasts, you can go out there and look for them there. Also look at CIPOD.us to go find older episodes, so you can hear all the cool stuff that we talk about on a wide range of topics. We don't just do politics here, but we'll probably stray into some of that today. So, big week, a lot of fuss, and a lot of fuss, it turns out, over next to nothing. This was one of those weeks, and full disclosure here, if we're going to talk about the media tonight, I do write for a major media outlet, and there's slow weeks and there's fast weeks, right? And then there's weeks like this that look like they're fast weeks, but are actually slow weeks dressed up as fast weeks. And we'll sort of get into that. But there were a couple stories this week that didn't exactly turn out to be all they were hyped up to be. Josh Hugo, co-host. Faithful friend, sir. How much do you trust the media?
Well, I would say I'm trying to think of some clever joke, probably involving lawyers and maybe car salesmen, but I'll just say not very much.
Oh, I mean, I would have gone with the clever joke if I was you, but I guess that works.
I would have too, but here we are.
Fair enough. So, and maybe we should even back up more, right? Because everybody wants to know. Gallup wants to know, and all the polling agents, they all want to know how much you trust the media. But what qualifies as the media? Because that line used to be really clear. I mean, when I was growing up, there was a handful of networks, and the news came from those. That's kind of the only place that you got your news. And now it seems like there's probably a dozen people on my block who are vlogging from their basements that could be considered news. So what is the media anymore? Where are the lines for that, or are there any?
Well, I mean, I would think that to be the media means you have some sort of a news gathering apparatus yourself. I mean, in my mind, it means you have reporters who are actually traveling or at least calling people and doing original research. I guess original research would be, in my mind, what qualifies you as being the media.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, it turns out Americans are not very trusting of the media. There was a Gallup poll from last year that was discussing the fact that 45% of Americans trust the mass media, which is actually up from 2016, which was kind of a low point in trust in the media, which, at least in part explains the presidential election. But that's up from 41% in 2017 and then 32% in 2016. The Democrats' current trust, they broke it down by party. Democrats' current trust is the highest that's been in the past 20 years. Boy, I wonder why that would be. And then trust has also increased among Republicans and independents, which is actually more significant, I think, than the last stat. Because the party that's in power, the media is usually going to be more critical. And one media or the other, depending on which one you lean to, is going to be more critical of that party. Therefore, that party's supporters are going to tend to dislike it more at the time. That's kind of what it seems to be. Another really interesting trend on there was that, if you look at Republicans and independents, their trust has increased too, which sort of points to almost a reaction against 2016. I mean, do you see any other explanation for that?
Well, I think that it makes sense if you understand that the media has become increasingly fragmented, especially in the last couple of years, especially since Trump. It was, for many years. Fox News, of course, being the carrier for the right wing side of the media, with most of the other networks going left. But that divide has become so severe in recent days. It's almost like I think everybody's going to their own source of news. And because everybody's going to their own source, of course, they approve of what they're going to. They're going to the source that tells them what they want to hear, that reinforces their preconceptions, their bias, whatever that happens to be. And because they're hearing things they agree with, well, of course, they like it more. So I guess I would think that if all sides are trusting the media more, your instinct would be to think that's a good thing because the media is getting better, but it might actually be a bad thing because it shows that there's just more voices saying what people want to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's potentially the case, and I'd have to look at. I mean, I have to look at a little bit more of the polling statistics that I have not really dived into yet to see if if they really defined the media, or if they if they laid any sort of parameters on that at all to help people decide. So the top three. This was by another article from July of last year in The Hill, that noted the top three most trusted news sources in America are BBC, Fox News, and PBS. I thought that was really striking in itself. I mean, BBC, sure, PBS, sure. Those are sort of generally considered neutral, right? They just have a long history. But Fox News, number two, how exactly did that happen? I mean, does anybody really mistake Fox News for being unbiased?
It seems like people mistake whatever confirms their biases for being unbiased, which unfortunately is sort of the self-reinforcing nature of bias. When you're biased, you don't know you're biased.
Unfortunately. But I think in this case, you also might be splitting the vote, right? So the folks on the right, if you ignore small outlets like The Blaze and places, I say small in relative terms, Fox News is pretty much the only major network that most of the folks on the right feel comfortable with. I guess that's the safest way to put that. And so you really only have one outlet there, where you have, if you look at the other side, you could really split the vote like 10 ways, right? So it's not entirely surprising that the trust would be higher there, because there's a whole segment of the population that kind of only trusts Fox News, which is a problem in and of itself. But I digress. So one of the most interesting numbers about the Gallup poll was that young Americans are most distrustful of the mainstream media, and then each older bracket gets increasingly more trusting. And so once you get to like over 65 Americans, they are the most trusting of the news media in general. And I think that's that points to the way that things have changed in the past few decades. And I think a lot of folks are trying to keep up with those changes. But I can't imagine being raised in a time when, news reporters were kind of taken as gospel truth, and then somehow reaching our age where, you have to decide between whether, decide if what you're looking at is CNN or InfoWars. I can't imagine that would be such a shock, So as my lifetime has been relatively short, I can look at those two things and go, okay, I can sort of wade through this and see what makes sense and cross-reference and look for links and substantiating sources, all that stuff. But I can't imagine growing up in the in the 60s and then having to see the media the way it is now and trying to make sense of it all.
Well, I mean, in the past, in the 60s and even earlier, I guess probably post-World War II is when this ideal arose. There was this idea that journalism was like a noble calling, that journalists were supposed to keep the politicians honest. They were supposed to expose the corruption of the businesses. They're supposed to be crusaders for truth, muckrakers, digging, sometimes risking their lives, to expose the truth. And I guess when I was a child back in the late 80s, in school, I remember, I think this would have been in second grade, we were taught that very explicitly, that that's what reporters were supposed to do. It was almost like a second grade civics lesson. We were learning about question words, the who, what, where, how, all those. And as part of that lesson, they talked about, well, this is what reporters do. Reporters for newspapers and television, they're supposed to go out and discover these facts for us. And that's a vital role for society. We were taught that. And I think that in the past, people sort of, believed it. That wouldn't have been taught in my school if people who were adults at the time, in the 80s, hadn't actually thought that that's how it worked.
Mm-hmm. No, fair enough. And I think that I see that when I look back, I see that sort of assumption that there's this noble corporate responsibility of journalists to, keep the government in check and inform people of what's really going on and tell the truth of the world. In fact, I remember a clip that Rush Limbaugh did way back in the day. Where he was I think he had sound bites from a journalist awards dinner or something like that. I don't remember which one it was. It was years ago now, back in the 90s. But this young reporter stood up and said, I went into journalism because I really wanted to do something important and change the world. And Rush, the dramatic way he always does, stop the tape, and he said, that's the problem right there. You went into journalism to change the world, but that's not what journalists are supposed to do. Journalists are supposed to report the world. Like that's your job. Like your job, your value is to report the world. And if that changes the world in a way that you want, good. If not, good. You know, whatever. Your job is to report. Your job is to inform. It's not your job to go be an activist. But at that time, it was already creeping in. Now we've seen that sort of blossom, and we've seen it really bear fruit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on both sides, unfortunately.
Yeah, very much so. And you know, so this term fourth estate gets used on the news media. And I did a quick Google search today, just kind of find the background of that. It's just one of those things you grow up hearing, but you don't really know the origins of it. It's actually kind of cool. It turns out it originated in 1700s England. Supposedly with Edmund Burke. But I don't really like the term because I feel like there's this sort of weird, you know, like you said, there's this sort of weird responsibility placed on journalists, and it's easy to forget that these are businesses.
What does that term mean, the fourth estate? Like what is implied by when you say the fourth estate, what does that mean?
You know, I'd love to make up something ridiculous right now just because I know you would buy it. But I'll avoid that for the listener's sake.
Thank you.
So the fourth estate so suppose this, as the story goes, this was a speech in Parliament that was given in the British Parliament that was discussing the different, you know, roles and sections of government, and then someone referred to the press gallery as the fourth estate more important than the rest. So it was sort of granting this power to the media.
Like the fourth branch of government, basically.
Yes, gotcha. Absolutely.
Using that British lingo, talking about estates, I'm like, but yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense now. And don't you wish that was true? I mean, you say that, and that's the ideal, and that's, I guess, what a lot of journalists believe about themselves. And don't you wish it was true to hear that, if there was like this fourth branch of government whose responsibility was just to keep the rest accountable and to serve the people by telling them the truth so that other branches couldn't hide it? That sounds so good.
Well, personally, no, because it sounds like, I mean, that's what the other three are supposed to do, right? Like, well, I don't want them to abdicate their responsibility to a fourth estate. I mean, yes, in theory, it's sort of like, you know, would you love an absolutely benevolent dictator? Well, I mean, how absolute is absolutely, right? No, but the fourth estate. So, like, here's the problem. People look at this as a sort of unofficial branch of government, like, oh, they have a responsibility to the public and all these things. But ultimately, they don't, right? Like, that's eventually people were going to find out that if Dan Rather lied to you, nothing happens to Dan Rather. Like, he's not going to get voted out of office.
Right.
Nothing. There's not. That's the problem, is that branches of government are directly or indirectly accountable to the people. The media is not, except in terms of dollars and cents. They're businesses, and they're not any more accountable or less accountable than Google or your local grocery store. I mean, that's just the way businesses work. And so we've reached this sort of breaking point now where you have this, I think, this sort of American apple pie ideal of what journalism should be, and the ugly reality of what it is becoming, which really came out in a couple ways this week that was just awful. So we talked about, you know, young Americans being most distrustful of the mainstream media. Shots were fired at the younger generation this week during this whole MAGA teens debacle that was so awful. In case you didn't know it, in case you were somehow under a rock and didn't see Twitter this week.
Well, Twitter or the front page of any major news source. Even Fox News had this on their front page as it was quote unquote breaking.
And we know how trustworthy they are now.
Apparently not that much more, but go on.
Yeah. So the original reports that came out showed a group of this happened right after the March for Life in Washington, D.C., which is, you know, the number one most ignored event in media. But the original reports that came out showed a group of teenagers wearing the trademark "Make America Great Again" hats, who were in this short video that showed them surrounding a Native American man who was smacking a drum, and this one teen in particular who was just very, very close to this Native American man, who, by the way, every headline called a veteran, a Native American veteran. And this kid was looking at him and just had this giant grin on his face that could alternatively be described as a smile or a smirk. Okay, right. Depending on which. Then that's going to be an important term. So jot that down in your notes. It's going to come back. It'll be on the test. So the longer video then came out after a giant controversy had erupted over this shorter video, and people saying he was trying to intimidate, that they had surrounded this guy, and were acting in very overtly racist ways, chanting "Build the Wall," all these things that are basically exactly what you would expect to hear if you had a bunch of leftists trying to caricature a bunch of boys in MAGA hats, right? That's pretty much what it was. Then a longer video comes out, paints a completely different picture. Turns out that there had been an altercation between this group of folks who were, high schoolers from a Catholic school that were waiting for their bus to arrive and go home after the march, and then turned out there was a bunch of other protesters there for something else, and they clashed. These folks started hurling these other folks from an extreme racist group. What were they called? What was this group called?
I think they call themselves the Black Israelites.
Yeah, the black Hebrew Israelites or something like ridiculous,
that.
which is redundant too, right? Like, not only are you a racist, but you're a dumb racist. Like, it's redundant. It really bothers me.
Yeah, but these guys, these self-described Black Israelites, they were hurling some really vile insults at the group of boys with the MAGA hats. What I found to be the most vile of the insults they hurled in this longer video was, of course, there were some black students who were mixed in with this group from the Catholic school with the MAGA hats on, and they were calling those black students race traitors and warning them that their white friends were going to kill them and sell their organs. So that's the nature of the sort of conflict that was going on prior to the Native American man entering the scene. There was some really nasty insults flying back and forth. Mostly from these Black Israelite guys throwing the insults, but
right. And then this Native American fellow, there was also Indigenous Peoples March of some sort there as well. Which is where these folks came from. They came over, saw the tensions, and according to their side of the story, they came in with the drum and started chanting and praying in their language to sort of calm the situation down. Okay. Well, at the time that they did this, the boys, who really didn't, according to their own accounts anyway, did not know how to respond to these insults and verbal affronts being thrown at them, started to repeat a bunch of school chants, which were very loud and somewhat obnoxious, honestly, if you watch the video. But they're teenagers, right? That's what they're going to do. They're not going to know what to do with this. So they're in Washington, D.C., and they're getting a bunch of insults hurled at them, a bunch of degrading stuff thrown their way. Anyway.
And then suddenly this guy, so that's what's going on. And then suddenly this man beating a drum and chanting another language comes up to them.
Right.
So it's weird.
Right. To avoid dragging it out any further, he walked into this group of boys, got within inches of this kid's face, and continued beating the drum. Now, I don't personally, from the look of it, it doesn't look like he's being aggressive. It just looks like he's just sort of careless about, doesn't care who's around him or what he's doing. He's just, if he was trying to defuse the situation, great, but he just walked up to this kid and started beating the drum in his face, and the kid didn't back away because there's like 1,000 people around him. So, anyway, but the way that the short video was clipped and shown, it really looked like this kid was being intimidating and, just a total jerk, which, by the way, still I don't think qualifies as national headline news in any capacity, but in the longer video, it didn't even come out as that. I mean, this kid was just standing there smiling like any awkward teenager would do if somebody got at his face with a drum, right? Like, it's just really, it was just a really weird story. But at this point, the story is no longer what happened between the kids and the counter protesters, which has been really horrible, by the way. These kids have gotten death threats from a bunch of blue checkmark verified Twitter users. Twitter does nothing about it because Twitter is completely inconsistent and really doesn't care what people think of them. But they've gotten death threats. People have talked about, lock them in the school and burn it down. This is for people standing there while someone bangs a drum, seriously. But the story now is less about actually what happened in the confrontation or did not happen, and more about how embarrassing this whole thing has been for the news agencies that covered it, because they picked it up without any question, ran with it without any question, and many of them are now having to backtrack really quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, like you said, Joel, if you watch the longer video, if you understand the full context of what happened, basically nothing happened. It was an awkward situation where some people were mad at each other and some people were confused with each other, and nobody got hurt and really nothing happened. And the media took that and reported it as basically a bunch of evil, racist Trump supporters surrounding and abusing this innocent Native American guy. So basically nothing happened, and from nothing, they spun this wild story of these evil racist youth oppressing this guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know if this is the case in the rest of the country, but here in Iowa, there's been a precedent for that. I mean, there have been several very high-profile incidents here where high school students, for instance, at a basketball game a couple of years ago, there was a predominantly white high school playing a predominantly Latino high school, and a bunch of students started chanting USA, which is what kids do at a basketball game, right? That was considered racist, and it was front page news up here for several weeks. People had to apologize, and there was all this because people took the chant USA in a country called the USA to be racist. So there's that kind of thing. There were some pictures, and granted, there are some that are much more offensive than that. There was a couple. There were some teenagers up here who also, up here in Iowa, so I'm not really speaking well of my state tonight, but up here in Iowa, there's another high school group who stood out in a field wearing sort of KKK-ish garb and stood with rifles and had a burning cross in the middle. And it was really horrible, right? Horrible stuff. But they're teenagers, and nobody was hurt, and nobody was killed, and they're stupid teenagers. They're going to have this hung around their necks for the rest of their lives as it is. It was stupid and it was wrong. But do I need to open up the paper and read about it first thing on Sunday morning? Like, is that news? Do I care what these handful of teenagers in a small town did for a photo op? Not really, you know?
Well, one of my Facebook friends commented on that phenomenon today. I thought it was very insightful. Basically, the fact that these stories are presented in an attempt to make it look as if America is this racist country. You know, look what these kids did. You know, dressing up this way and performing these, I guess we'll say sort of pantomimes of these racist activities. And these are presented as evidence of how racist our country is. But really, it's kind of the opposite, because what we are is a country that is so appalled by and so affronted by racism that if anybody does anything that even looks a little bit racist, we excoriate them on the front page. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Yeah, and up here, the other funny thing about that, it's not really funny, but at Drake University here in Des Moines, there was a case of these supposedly threatening racist letters being left around campus. Turned out that at least there's at least one or two of them now that have been proved that whoever wrote them really was just self-tormenting. Basically, some girl wrote them to herself, and has admitted to it now to the police. So it's like if you can't find racism, manufacture it, right? So, but the other part of this though, and this is the part that kind of upset a lot of people, is that these are high school kids. These are teenagers.
Minors.
These are not right. These are not people who are, and I'm not going to act like, they're babies. They're teenagers. I know what it's like to be a teenager. Okay, I was a teenager too, believe it or not. And there's this between what's gone on here in Iowa that I just described and the MAGA teens business and the Kavanaugh hearing. I'm seeing a little bit of a pattern here that there's a strong willingness to go back and condemn. Basically, we're moving the age limits for total and utter responsibility back. And I think that's sort of inevitable in the internet age because, we all have social media accounts, and these kids are going to be looking back 50 years from now at posts they made when they were 6 and 8. But where's the room to be a teenager? Because I was sitting there looking at that group of teens at the Lincoln Memorial, the MAGA teens, and thinking, I honestly don't know what I would have done differently if I was there. I mean, maybe backed up into the 12 people behind me a little bit more and given the guy a little more space. Like that's probably the only thing that I would have done differently as a teenager there myself. Like, I don't know what is expected of them. And clearly these folks from their statements didn't know either. But be that as it may, the story now is about how the media has twisted it. And that wasn't even their first offense this week. Within the last week, there was another one. Josh, tell us what happened with BuzzFeed.
Oh, yeah. Basically, BuzzFeed had published a story. BuzzFeed, that very reputable, very prestigious news outlet known for their deep investigations. BuzzFeed had issued a report saying that, according to anonymous sources, supposedly within the Mueller investigation, Donald Trump had instructed Cohen, his lawyer, to lie to Congress if asked about a certain real estate deal in Moscow. So long story short, anonymous sources said that Trump had told Cohen to lie, and BuzzFeed reported this, which isn't that remarkable of itself because, it's BuzzFeed. You go there for junk. It's basically just like clickbait spam on all their channels. But the thing was that the other news organizations, like ABC and CNN and MSNBC, picked up on this, and they made the BuzzFeed report their own headline news for the day. And I have a report here. It's in the Daily Caller, which of course is a had its own biases. But the Daily Caller is reporting that between CNN and MSNBC, they mentioned the word impeachment, saying that Trump could be impeached over these revelations from the BuzzFeed story about 200 times collectively, on the day this came out. So the other news organizations who typically you'd think of as being more prestigious or more credible, like CNN, they just took this BuzzFeed story and ran hard with it.
And then it turned out to be bad.
That's okay. Mueller has, well, of course, there's been common speculation about his investigation. Yeah, it's been going on for what? Has it been 2 years now? Getting on there.
I lost count.
Yeah, I've lost count. Many months of the Mueller investigation, and he and his office have been very hesitant to comment on it or to comment on any of the reports about it. But Mueller's office actually took the unprecedented step of coming out and making a press release to say that the BuzzFeed article was not accurate.
That's a pretty big condemnation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, naturally they should have a sympathetic posture toward it. So we had two giant lie burgers from the media this week, two giant whoppers. Why did we have those? What's the incentive behind it? So you see, when I look at these stories, I try to think, because there's a business here, right? They're running a business. BuzzFeed has to make money. And so does the Washington Times, and so does CNN, and so does everybody else. They got to make money. At the end of the day, they still got to get a paycheck. So why would you do this? Because it seems to me like if you put out something like this, it's embarrassing. And this is the type of thing that, offenses much smaller than this a couple decades ago would have sunk a news organization. So why would they do this? Why take this chance?
Well, I think it comes down to what is their goal and what are the desires of the audience? Because sad to say, but it's true. If you study human nature, of course I'm making myself sound all wise. I'm a student of human nature, but if you study human nature, you know that people generally don't like to hear the truth so much. They really want to hear things that validate themselves. People want to be told that they are a good person. They want to be told that they are on the right side of morality, on the right side of history, whatever. And so what I see in these two stories, in both cases, is I guess sort of a wish fulfillment fantasy going on, where MSNBC and CNN and a large part of their audience would just love to see Trump impeached. That's like what they're just waiting every day, waiting for the news, for the shoe to drop, for the hammer to come down, for Trump to finally be on the chopping block of impeachment. And I think they're just so waiting for it that when they see this BuzzFeed story come up, they just jump on it. They're like, "Oh, this is it, at last!" And without really thinking about it, they just go with it. It's what they want, Mm-hmm. Kind of the same thing. Another comment that I saw this week about the MAGA teen story. What was the comment? How was it phrased? It was, "In our country today, we have a very high demand for racists and a very low supply of racists." So we have a lot of people who have this vision of America as a racist country, who have this vision of America as a country that's in need of this sort of total reform, and they see Trump as the symbol of this resurgent white supremacism that needs to be stamped out. But there just isn't that much evidence of that if you look at the news and look at the world. So I guess the same sort of wish fulfillment, it seems to me, is going on here, where you have these people who just desperately want confirmation and validation of their viewpoint that America is this racist country that needs to be set straight. And the image of this smirking teen with a MAGA hat smirking at a Indian or a Native American man is their confirmation. So it shows them what they want to see, so they run with it.
The memes have been great around the smirk, by the way, and the left is not helping their own cause with this, because part of what they've actually done now in a lot of the reactions to this poor kid has been to come out and suggest that it's an evil smirk of white privilege that is more harmful than guns, knives, and bombs, because that's an exaggeration. But the point is, they're out there saying that this kid was his smirk was threatening and harmful, and that he had committed an atrocity by standing there smirking at this guy. So hence the question, do you have a problem with man smirking? Is man smirking the next thing that we're going to have to confront as enlightened American civil rights activists? Stop the man smirking. Gracious. No, when I look at why they would run with this story, I kind of ask myself, why is there a BuzzFeed to start with? Because BuzzFeed wasn't there when I was growing up. BuzzFeed is there because they grabbed a niche and went to war against the major networks. And they are currently competing for clicks against all of these other outlets. And every one of them in these major outlets are fighting for their lives. The media is not doing well from a financial perspective. There are very few major outlets that are really cutting it right now. And so when I see this, I see a vicious competition for clicks. And the only way that you get clicks is by being the first one. If CNN breaks the news, CNN is going to get the lion's share of the views on it, and views are how you get paid. And so when I see things like this, I see the verification and digging down and doing that additional legwork and research that now comes second to being the first one out of the gate, because it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. And it's basically that's what I see in this is the incentive to run these stories. Yes, sure, it can be politically motivated as well, but there's also a financial reason to do that. Because when you run these things, even without validation, even if you know they might backfire, you will still get that initial massive burst of activity. And that's what people are gunning for. And these traditional outlets, especially the Times and the Post and the Wall Street Journal, all these places, they have been news giants forever now. Imagine being in that space and being this established, reputable organization with a bunch of Pulitzers hanging on your wall, and you have to compete with BuzzFeed. I mean, that's not a very enviable position to be in, right? So, I mean, I see a rationalization here from a practical standpoint as well as to why they run these things. And the business logic of it really is sort of undeniable. But the question to me is, where does that leave us? Because that doesn't provide a lot of incentive to go do the right thing. So what should the news media actually be doing, and is there a way to incentivize that?
Well, I mean, in the past, you had to subscribe to the newspaper, and they got their money from, buying the paper physically.
Right, which is one of two ways they still do, right? You see paywalls in a lot of papers, and then you also see advertising.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the big two.
The thing with me is it's a problem that seems so hard to deal with, because I would gladly pay a subscription fee for a website that I felt that I could trust. If there was some website out there that I felt that when I go there, I'm going to see articles that are well-researched, that are honest, and that are actually going to be, relevant news, not just petty gossip, mm-hmm. I would be glad to pay for that website. But I'm not sure that I know of a site like that. It's not that I'm unwilling to pay for news. It's that I don't really see any news that I'm willing to pay for. That makes sense.
No, that makes sense. But to me, I look at it and I go, I don't know, because of this, I don't want to have to trust. And I know you have to have some trust if you're getting your information from anywhere. But to me, I have a little bit more trust in competition than I do in any single outlet. And so part of my approach has been, have sources from the left, have sources from the right, have sources that I consider to be pretty much in the middle. Nobody's unbiased, but I think some are better than others. And just kind of compare and contrast those. And you'll generally pick up different sides of the story, because there's different types of lies, right? A dumb person just lies overtly out front. I never said that. No, that's just a dumb lie, right? The smart liars will use selective truths instead. And that's where most reporting, and especially most political reporting, that's when people talk about fake news, people talk about the lies from the media, that's the kind of stuff they're talking about. Not necessarily that, they came out and said something was absolutely true that wasn't, which does occasionally happen. But for the most part, it's what they choose to omit, or what they choose to add, or in some cases, just what they choose to cover. I mean, there's a major complaint against mainstream media outlets that just the basis of what they choose to cover and not cover constitutes a major bias, regardless of how the stories are worded. Yeah. And then there's a whole lot of tricks like that, right? Like I often note the quotation mark bias. which is where you take a perfectly normal term that's been used in common vernacular for a long time and you put it in quotation marks needlessly. It's a device. It's a journalistic device to add doubt where there doesn't need to be any. An instance of that up here was there was a bill in the legislature for school choice. It was called the school choice bill. Everybody called it school choice. That's what it was, school choice. That's the issue. But every time it was referenced in the paper, it was in quotation marks. And the point was to discredit, is it really school choice, or is that just what they call it? That's what happens when you put quotes around something. And so these are the kinds of tricks that I think make people lose that faith in the media. And unfortunately, now here's another angle on this: it is coming back to haunt them. It is backfiring on them. Maybe not as suddenly as it would have 20 years ago, but it is. And that's why these organizations are not holding their ground, and that's why they are having so much trouble staying afloat. The question is, where do we go from here? Because increasingly, as you noticed, people are seeking out, or as you noted, people are seeking out news that agrees with them, or they're turning to that sort of infotainment brand of podcasts. Hey, I don't know one of those to point people to, of podcasts and YouTube shows. And, you've got the Young Turks on the left, you got Ben Shapiro on the right, you've got people who are carving out all sorts of little niches for themselves, trying to inform people while also entertaining them. And what I'm thinking is, if I am NPR, how do I compete with that? I don't actually know how to compete with that, because if, especially as these biases continue to grow and the confirmation bias continues to kind of circle around itself, I don't know how you compete with that and try to be unbiased and objective. I mean, it's really difficult. There's not a lot of market for reasonability.
Well, the thing is, as far as things being infotainment, our culture are so saturated with news now, and maybe you can think of some time in your life when you've gone on vacation or whatever, and you've been...
I don't believe in vacations.
Yeah, well, sometime when you've been quote-unquote unplugged for a day or 2 days or a week, and you didn't get any news. Did you miss it? It's like, how much of the news that we receive is actually in any way relevant to us, So I feel like a lot of the problem is that we just have, when we go looking for news, it's not, as consumers, it seems like we're not so much going looking for information that'll be useful for us that we can actually use. If you're going to the newspaper like people used to back in the day, you're going to the newspaper and look at the stock sheets to see how your stock did. That's information that you actually want to do something with.
Sure.
Or if you're looking at some announcement in the local paper saying when something is scheduled or what some new policy of the mayor is going to be. But usually when people go to the news nowadays, they're looking just for something to talk about. They're looking for some sort of something interesting that will pique their curiosity or their sense of scandal, perhaps, or they can go and talk about on Twitter. So,
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So I think maybe a part of the problem is we just need less news.
Yeah, but how do you do that?
I don't know.
There's, like you said, there's an information overload right now, and the problem is it's really cheap to produce because you don't need. In fact, some of the sources that I really appreciate the best are not really news producers at all. They're news curators or aggregators. I mean, these are places where, because frankly, that was the brilliance of Drudge, right? That's why Drudge got to be Drudge. Is that the Drudge Report just took a bunch of other news sources and piled them all together on a page where I can click through it and read a headline and a few paragraphs and get what I need for the day. And that was kind of a novel concept, as opposed to having to, fight through a paywall and then sort of filter through articles looking for something that you think you might be interested in, hoping it shows up in the suggested column, And so I think now you've got that sort of element of information just being so widely available and so cheap. And now it was really interesting that during the whole fake news, outrage after 2016, one of the things that was noted is so many of these fake news sites, and I mean real fake news sites, like people that really just make up headlines and throw stuff out there, they get so many more clicks and shares, and I mean, it's not even close. They blow away some major sites that you would know about, and they make tons of money just on advertising. I mean, these people are making thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in ads, sometimes monthly, and it's all for nonsense. Seriously, this is just people sitting in their basements punching stuff onto a keyboard and
writing fiction,
right, making up provocative things and waiting for people to get angry and share it. That's all they did, and so that's where it's, look at it. To me, I have a really hard time seeing how we turn that around. Now, one place that I'm seeing, again, to go back to the skepticism of young people on this, that's actually one of the things that gives me hope, because a lot of these young folks are actually starting their own YouTube channels. They're starting their own podcasts. They're going out there and joining this giant crowd of information providing and coming at it with a little more skeptical eye. They're taking these different news sources from different sides, balancing it out, and offering summaries. And thankfully, you can look at them and see that there are some. Obviously, there's going to be good and bad in any mix, right? But you can see in a lot of them, they don't have the same business considerations that a lot of mainstream media outlets do. And it's sort of refreshing when you get into a lot of these communities, YouTube communities and whatnot. You can see a lot of folks come together and offer different opinions on things, and you can get a balanced view just by a multitude of sources. And that, I think, might be a protection against where we're going. I mean, I don't know. You have to wait and see how society plays out on this, but that might be a slight protection against it, and more of a free market approach, right? Where we have information offered from all these different sites and all these different sources, but people can actually pick and choose not just what they like, but once that pendulum swings back, what they consider to be the most fair, the most accurate. And of course, as you said, you're willing to pay for that. I don't know if I'm to that point yet, but definitely you're willing to pay for that. There are some people out there who would pay for that trustworthiness. And as I think we see the sinking of these traditional media outlets, we should see some new outlets pop up with new strategies and new approaches to sort of bring that trust back. And clearly there have been some changes that have been successful in the mainstream media outlets themselves, which, explains at least in part the uptick between 2016 and today that we talked about earlier.
Well, I do. I subscribe to the print edition of World magazine, which I find to be a good source. It's a biweekly magazine. It's not very long, but it gives you a nice digest of the news from a Christian perspective. When I say Christian perspective, that relates more to their story selection than to any bias in the reporting. I mean, so there are some things out there. But what I found interesting about what you just said, Joel, about as far as these YouTube communities that are sort of self-curating, is that's user participation. That's people who want to know the truth, kind of getting together and finding it for themselves, which is exactly the opposite of what we talked about a few minutes ago, where people are looking for validation, looking for stories to confirm their biases. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a lot of it comes down to what does the audience want and what are people going to look for? But unfortunately, I don't have any good answers how you make people want good stuff. How do you make people want the truth instead of having their biases confirmed? I don't know how to do that.
Well, it's tough. I mean, and a lot of these, I think the part of the benefit of the YouTube communities and the sort of alternate news sources is that they don't yet have an established audience. A lot of people go there waiting to see where they will take the program. And there's a fight. I mean, there's a fight on the consumer's part to have an influence on that direction. And that's where you see the wars break out in the comment sections, which actually puts the content producer in a place where they have a lot of pressure to do their research, to cover themselves, to make something that is informative and will actually stand up to scrutiny. And so I think the more competitive the market becomes, the more that incentive is there, because you don't have the luxury of being a fourth estate sort of unrecognized government agency that gets to sit at the White House. You don't get to do that. The danger on the flip side is that if these places start to suck up all the monetization and there's not anything left for the traditional news outlets, well, then the other curated online communities go away as well, right? Because most of them are pulling their information from places that do have the money and the resources to send journalists in the field. So it is a tough spot. And I know we talked about it in an earlier episode about the way the media worked during the French Revolution. And it was really interesting to me that one of the keys that's often overlooked when you look back to the French Revolution was the media, that there was a state-sponsored media that was considered to be part of the problem. And with the overthrow of the government, there was an overthrow of the sources of information as well. And everyone got printing presses in their basement and started basically printing, competing sources. And it played into the hands of the revolutionaries and ultimately the Reign of Terror because nobody knew what to believe. And there were alternate facts, as you could say, everywhere, and there wasn't really this authoritative source, which was good because the state authority and the information source before that was not trustworthy either. But they sort of went out of the frying pan into the fire because now you could accuse anyone of being friendly to the aristocrats and they would lose their head. And so that's not necessarily better, right? So my question as we get to wrap this up, Josh Hugo, is this: should we try to restore faith in media? Is that a lost cause? Is it even worthwhile? Or do we need to be looking around the corner to the next big thing to replace it?
I think that's a fascinating question.
I'm guessing. Okay, so you haven't solved this one for us yet. I mean, you've had like 3 seconds now. I thought you would have this one down.
No, I take at least 5 seconds to come up with the answers to the big questions, Joel.
No, I think we're too close to the end to afford you 5 seconds. But you know what? I'm going to throw that question to our audience this week. Should we try to restore faith in media? Is that worthwhile? Do American media agencies, either the ones that we have now or the up-and-coming ones on the internet, do they need to come back for us to be able to get reliable information sources? Do we need to go back to the model that we had? Or is there a way to leverage this kind of growing network of online information providers and bloggers and the social media giants that are actually a major source of news now themselves, what people are saying and doing? Is there a way to take those and push them into the role of those old media providers and just change our attitude about it to the way that we approach news, make it more skeptical, make it more cynical in some cases, and potentially come out with information that will stand up to scrutiny? That's a question we'll be throwing to you this week. Make sure you're following us on social media at facebook.com/TheCI Show and on Twitter at The CI Show. Join the conversation with us there, and we will look forward to conversing with you about the role of the media this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. From Josh Hugo and I, thanks for listening to Constructive Interference.